You're sitting in a room in Islamabad on April 12th, 2026, and you've just shaken hands with an Iranian diplomat for the first time in decades of open hostility. The cameras aren't there. The world doesn't know this happened yet. You're J.D. Vance, the Vice President of the United States, and you've just looked the other side in the eye and said, "We can work something out." And for a few hours, it almost felt real. Then the flight home lands, and everything falls apart. This is a story about pressure, how it's applied, what it does, and what happens when the thing you designed to break the other side ends up breaking the deal instead. If you've ever wondered how a negotiation between nuclear powers actually unravels in real time, stick around, because what happened over the last 2 weeks between Washington and Tehran is one of the most instructive diplomatic collapses in recent memory. Let's go back to the beginning of April. The situation looked cautiously like it was moving. The U.S. and Iran had faced each other across a table in Islamabad for highly anticipated face-to-face peace talks, NPR. The kind of direct engagement that hadn't happened at this level in a long time. There was a ceasefire technically in place. J.D. Vance was there, Steve Witkoff was there, Jared Kushner was there. The Pakistanis had offered their capital as neutral ground. The machinery of diplomacy was running, however imperfectly, and the people operating it were at least in the same city. You are the American negotiator in that room. You know what you're working with. You have a president whose patience is not a renewable resource. You have a set of demands that, in their totality, amount to asking Iran to dismantle everything it has spent 40 years building, complete abandonment of uranium enrichment, dismantlement of its nuclear infrastructure. And you have a 48-hour clock, because that's about how long a Trump-era diplomatic window tends to stay open before something explodes it from the inside. The talks ended without an agreement. Vance said the two sides reached understanding on multiple points, but the one point that mattered, nuclear, was not resolved. Trump himself posted on Truth Social. The meeting went well, most points were agreed to, but the only point that really mattered, nuclear, was not. NPR. So the talks fail. Diplomatically uncomfortable, but not yet catastrophic. Countries fail to agree all the time. The question is always what happens next. Do you hold the table? Do you leave the door cracked? Do you take a breath and schedule something in 2 weeks? You don't. Not this administration. Within hours of the announcement that talks had collapsed, Trump posted that the U.S. Navy would begin blockading any and all ships trying to enter or leave the Strait of Hormuz. CENTCOM confirmed the blockade would begin at 10 a.m. Eastern Time the following Monday. The blockade would apply to ships docking in Iranian ports, the Arabian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman included. NPR. Think about what that decision means, not strategically, not morally, just mechanically. You've been in a room trying to negotiate a deal. The deal doesn't close, so instead of calling for another round, you announce a naval siege on the other party's ports within the same news cycle. You've now taken the thing you wanted to use as leverage and deployed it not before the talks, not during the talks, but immediately after the talks failed, which means it can't bring the Iranians back to the table. It can only punish them for not agreeing. And punishment is not leverage. Punishment is just punishment. And here's what punishment does in Iranian domestic politics. It hands the hardliners exactly what they need. You are now the Iranian foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi. You went to Islamabad. You sat across the table from American officials in a room that had been arranged by Pakistan, a Muslim-majority country with its own complex relationships to manage. And you negotiated in good faith, or at least in the direction of good faith. And then, within hours of those talks ending inconclusively, the United States announced It was blockading your country's ports. Arachi called blockading Iranian ports an act of war and a direct violation of the existing ceasefire agreement. Al Jazeera. He's not wrong as a matter of international norms. A naval blockade is, in the traditional definition of the laws of war, an act of war. It's the kind of thing countries historically declare against enemies, not against parties they were sitting across a table from 12 hours earlier. And so now you have a choice. Go back to the table while a blockade is actively strangling your ports, which would be interpreted domestically as capitulation to military coercion, or refuse to return until the blockade is lifted, which gives you the moral high ground internationally, but means the war machine keeps running. Iran chose the second option, which, from their internal political calculus, was the only option available to them. Tehran's position became explicit. The Iranian delegation would not return to the negotiating table until the blockade was lifted. The continued U.S. naval blockade of the Iranian ports, they said, was a violation of the ceasefire deal. NPR. Now, you're back in the American negotiator's seat, and here's the bind you've built for yourself. The blockade was announced as a pressure mechanism. The White House press secretary described it in precise terms. We are strangling their economy, and it's getting weakened by the second. Fox News, that is the stated goal. Strangulation as a diplomatic tool, and it may be working economically. There are reports of Iranian citizens bartering with cooking oil, of electricity conservation orders being issued by the president. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian appeared on state television urging residents to conserve electricity, saying the U.S. and Israel destroyed our infrastructure, and acknowledging the effect of the naval blockade on the country's ports. Fox News. So the pressure is landing. The question is whether pressure of this kind produces the outcome you want, which is a negotiated agreement, or the outcome you don't want, which is a cornered government that no longer has any domestic political room to be seen compromising with the nation that is actively squeezing the life out of its ports. You already know the answer, because you've seen it before. Sanctions and blockades, when applied without an off-ramp, don't tend to produce negotiations. They tend to produce entrenchment. They tend to harden exactly the factions you need to soften. And they create conditions where any leader who agrees to come back to the table while the blockade is running looks to his own people like he's agreeing to be strangled indefinitely in exchange for the theoretical possibility of a better deal. Trump, in a remarkable about-face, even by the standards of this administration, then extended the ceasefire hours before it was set to expire, while simultaneously keeping the blockade in place. He said he had directed our military to continue the blockade and, in all other respects, remain ready and able, and would extend a ceasefire until Iran submitted a unified proposal. Al Jazeera. No specific deadline, no defined endpoint. The ceasefire extended, the blockade maintained. Both things simultaneously true. Iran dismissed the extension as meaningless, pointing to the continued blockade as proof that the ceasefire existed in name only. NPR. And now you're watching something interesting happen to the geography of this crisis, because the Strait of Hormuz is not just an Iranian problem. It is not even primarily an American problem. Approximately 20% of the world's traded oil moves through that narrow channel. Defense Secretary Hegseth, when asked about European allies, said, "We are not counting on Europe, but they need the Strait of Hormuz much more than we do and might want to start doing less talking and having less fancy conferences in Europe." Fox News. He's right about the dependency. He's less right about what follows from it. The countries that need the Strait of Hormuz most are not going to be pressured into joining a military campaign against Iran because they need the Strait. They're going to be pressured into finding a solution, any solution. That reopens it, which means the longer this drags on, the more European and Asian pressure falls not on Iran, but on Washington to end the blockade as a precondition for talks, which is exactly the position Iran has been arguing since April 13th. By April 25th, CENTCOM reported that 37 vessels had been redirected as a result of the blockade. Fox News, 37 ships in approximately 12 days. The effects on global shipping are real. The threat of being attacked in the Strait had a profound effect on commercial vessels. Some ships with links to Iran attempted to move through, while others stayed away entirely after Iran attacked 3 vessels with gunfire. NPR. And then comes the day that collapses whatever momentum remained. April 24th, Arakchi flies to Islamabad. There is cautious international hope. Pakistan has been a patient host, a careful mediator, threading an extremely narrow needle between its relationships with both the United States and Iran. His spokesperson insists publicly that no direct meeting with the U.S. was planned, but his presence in Islamabad, the same city where the previous round of talks had been held, suggests that something was in motion. The Iranian foreign minister conveyed in his meetings that Iran demands the lifting of the U.S. naval blockade as a precondition for talk. About an hour after Arakchi left Islamabad, Trump decided to cancel the trip by his envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. Axios. Read that sequence again slowly. Iran's foreign minister arrives, states a condition, leaves. Trump cancels American travel. 1 hour later, Trump said Iran had offered a lot, but not enough. NPR Arakchi, for his part, posted on social media thanking the Pakistanis for their efforts and writing, "Have yet to see if the U.S. is truly serious about diplomacy." Axios. That line is doing a lot of work. Have yet to see if the U.S. is truly serious about diplomacy is not the language of a country preparing to offer concessions. It's the language of a country that has decided it holds the stronger narrative position and is willing to let the world see the other side refuse to show up. And this is the trap that the blockade built, because now the story is not Iran refuses to give up nuclear weapons. The story is Iran asked for the naval siege to end before talking. The U.S. refused and then canceled the meeting. That's a different story. That's a story in which one side is using a military instrument to force the other into negotiations without preconditions, which is not how negotiations work. And the other side is saying, if you want us at the table, stop treating us like a besieged city. You have to understand what a blockade communicates, not just what it does. Economically, yes, it applies pressure, but symbolically, it says, we do not recognize your government as a legitimate party to a negotiation. We treat you as a hostile state whose commerce we have the right to interdict at will. You cannot simultaneously hold that posture and expect the other side to come to the table in a posture of good faith engagement. These two things are contradictory. They cannot coexist. Senator Lindsey Graham responded to the breakdown by saying that establishing firm control over the Strait of Hormuz should be the top priority of the United States, and that U.S. military engagement may be required in the short term. Axios. There it is. The escalation ladder being made visible. If talks are off, the option that gets surfaced is not more creative diplomacy. It's not a third mediator or a modified proposal or a gesture that gives Iran something small enough to justify returning to the table. It's military engagement, because in the logic of maximum pressure, when maximum pressure doesn't produce capitulation, the answer is always more pressure, not different pressure, more. And the Iranian side has its own escalation logic running in parallel. A Pentagon assessment shared with Congress indicated that clearing Iranian-laid mines from the Strait of Hormuz could take up to 6 months. NPR, 6 months. That's not a tactical problem. That's a strategic one. The mines are leverage. The closed strait is leverage. Every day of a blockade is a day the Iranians can point to as evidence that the United States is conducting economic warfare on a civilian population, which recruits sympathy internationally and domestic resolve internally. Two countries, both applying pressure, both reading the other's pressure as proof of bad faith, both using the same escalation cycle, both watching the space for negotiation get smaller by the day. This is what a diplomatic collapse looks like in real time. Not a single dramatic moment, not a slammed door or a broken treaty. It's a series of decisions that each make sense within their own internal logic, each one closing off an option that was open the day before, until the only options left are the ones nobody actually wants. The blockade was designed to create urgency, to make the economic pain of non-agreement so intense that Iran would accept terms it had previously rejected. That theory makes sense if you believe the other side's decision-making is purely rational and purely economic. It makes less sense if you understand that Iranian leaders are also managing domestic legitimacy, that being seen to capitulate under military siege is existentially dangerous for any Iranian politician, regardless of ideology, and that the hardliners in Tehran are strengthened, not weakened, every time a pressure campaign is visibly applied. Observers noted that Iran had discovered new leverage in its control of the Strait of Hormuz, and that this conflict had not gone the way the Trump administration expected from the beginning. House of Commons Library. That's the line that matters most. The war, the pressure campaign, the blockade. None of it unfolded the way the architects expected. And when the unexpected happens in a maximum pressure framework, the answer you keep reaching for is more maximum, more pressure, as if the only variable that needs adjusting is the intensity and not the strategy itself. You are now no one in particular. You're just watching a situation where both sides have legitimate grievances and real leverage and zero trust and no mechanism for building any, because every confidence-building measure either side might offer is immediately met with a unilateral escalation from the other. Iran lays mines. America blockades ports. America cancels envoy travel. Iran's foreign minister leaves Islamabad. Ceasefire extended with no end date. Blockade maintained with no end date. 37 ships redirected. 6 months to clear the mines if it came to that. And somewhere in all of this, the actual humans. The Iranian families bartering cooking oil, the shipping workers whose livelihoods have been disrupted, the Pakistani diplomats who spent weeks arranging a meeting that lasted less than 48 hours before collapsing. They don't appear in the Truth Social post. They don't appear in the CENTCOM press releases. They're just the background against which the leverage game is played. That's how this works. Not because anyone in the room is a cartoon villain. Not because the people making these decisions are indifferent to consequences, but because once a framework of maximum pressure and zero-sum posturing is established, the incentives inside that framework produce these outcomes almost automatically. The blockade was always going to be used as an argument against returning to talks because, of course it was. That's what blockades do. And the response to Iran not returning to talks was always going to be more pressure, because that's what maximum pressure doctrine demands. The talks are off. The blockade remains. The ceasefire extension has no defined expiration. Iran has said the extension is meaningless, while the naval siege continues, and the next move is unclear to everyone. NPR. That's where it is right now. Not resolved, not escalating into open war at this exact moment, just suspended in a state of maximum tension with no agreed mechanism for de-escalation and no sign that either side has identified a face-saving path back to a table. That's how it works. You apply enough pressure that the other side can't come back without looking weak, and then you're surprised when they don't come back.